was very surprised when he woke up next morning and found himself in bed. He decided it was a nice feeling as he stretched himself and pulled the sheets up round his head with a paw. He reached out with his feet and found a cool spot for his toes. One advantage of being a small bear in a large bed was that there was so much room. After a few minutes, he poked his head out cautiously and sniffed. There was a lovely smell of something coming from under the door. It seemed to be getting nearer and nearer. There were footsteps, too, coming up the stairs. As they stopped by his door, there was a knock, and Mrs. Bird's voice called out, "Are you awake, young Paddington?" "Only just," called out Paddington, rubbing his eyes. The door opened. "You've had a good sleep," said Mrs. Bird as she placed a tray on his bed and drew the curtains. "And you're a very privileged person to have breakfast in bed on a weekday." Paddington eyed the tray hungrily. There was half a grapefruit in a bowl, a plate of bacon and eggs, some toast, and a whole pot of marmalade, not to mention a large cup of tea. "Is all that for me?" he exclaimed. "If you don't want it, I can soon take it away again," said Mrs. Bird. "Oh, I do," said Paddington hurriedly. "It's just that I've never seen so much breakfast before." "Well, you'd better hurry up with it." Mrs. Bird turned in the doorway and looked back. "Because you're going on a shopping expedition this morning with Mrs. Brown and Judy, and all I can say is, thank goodness I'm not going too." She closed the door. "I wonder what she means by that," said Paddington. But he didn't worry about it for very long. There was far too much to do. It was the first time he'd ever had breakfast in bed, and he soon found it wasn't quite as easy as it looked. First of all, he had trouble with the grapefruit. Every time he pressed it with his spoon, a long stream of juice shot up and hit him in the eye, which was very painful. And all the time he was worried because the bacon and eggs were getting cold. Then there was the question of the marmalade. He wanted to leave room for the marmalade. In the end, he decided it would be much nicer if he mixed everything up on one plate and sat on the tray to eat it. "Oh, Paddington," said Judy when she entered the room a few minutes later and found him perched on the tray. "Whatever are you doing now? Do hurry up. We're waiting for you downstairs." Paddington looked up, an expression of bliss on his face, that part of his face which could be seen behind eggy whiskers and toast crumbs. He tried to say something, but all he could manage was a muffled grunting noise which sounded like "It's coming," all rolled into one. "Really," Judy took out her handkerchief and wiped his face, "you're the stickiest bear imaginable. If you don't hurry up, all the nice things will be gone. Emmy's going to buy a complete new outfit from Barkridge's. I heard her say so. Now comb your fur quickly and come on down." As she closed the door, Paddington looked at the remains of his breakfast. Most of it was gone, but there was a large piece of bacon left which it seemed a pity to waste. He decided to put it into his suitcase in case he got hungry later on. He hurried into the bathroom, rubbed his face over with some warm water. Then he combed his whiskers carefully, and a few moments later, not looking perhaps as clean as he had done the evening before, but quite smart, he arrived downstairs. "Now," said Mrs. Brown, "come along, both of you." "Very strange," he said. "There seems to be a smell of bacon everywhere this morning. Can you smell it, Paddington?" Paddington started. He put the suitcase guiltily behind himself and sniffed. He had several expressions which he kept for emergencies. There was his thoughtful expression, when he stared into space and rested his chin on a paw. Then there was his innocent one, which wasn't really an expression at all. He decided to use this one. "It's very strong," he said truthfully, for he was a truthful bear. Then he added, perhaps not quite so truthfully, "I wonder where it's coming from." "If I were you," whispered Judy as they walked along the road towards the underground, "I should be more careful in future when you pack your suitcase." Paddington looked down. A large piece of bacon stuck out of the side of his case and was trailing on the pavement. "Shoo!" cried Mrs. Brown as a grubby-looking dog came bounding across the road. Paddington waved his suitcase. "Go away, dog," he said sternly. The dog licked its lips, and Paddington glanced anxiously over his shoulder as he hurried on, keeping close behind Mrs. Brown and Judy. "Oh dear," said Mrs. Brown, "I have a funny feeling about today, as if things are going to happen. Do you ever have that feeling, Paddington?" Paddington considered it for a moment. "Sometimes," he said vaguely as they entered the station. "I suppose," Mrs. Brown said to Paddington as they stepped onto the escalator, "we really ought to carry you." It says you're supposed to carry dogs. It doesn't say anything about bears. Paddington didn't answer. He was following behind in a dream. Being a very short bear, he couldn't easily see over the side. When he did, his eyes nearly popped out with excitement. There were people everywhere. He'd never seen so many. There were people rushing down one side, and there were more people rushing up the other. Everyone seemed in a terrible hurry. As he stepped off the escalator, he found himself carried away between a man with an umbrella and a lady with a large shopping bag. By the time he managed to push his way free, both Mrs. Brown and Judy had completely disappeared. It was then that he saw a most surprising notice. He blinked at it several times to make sure, but each time he opened his eyes it said the same thing. Follow the amber light to Paddington. Paddington decided the underground was quite the most exciting thing that had ever happened to him. He turned and trotted down the corridor, following the amber lights, until he met another crowd of people who were queuing for the up escalator. Here, said the man at the top as he examined Paddington's ticket. What's all this? You haven't been anywhere yet. I know, said Paddington unhappily. I think I must have made a mistake at the bottom. The man sniffed suspiciously and called across to an inspector. There's a young bear here smelling of bacon. Says he made a mistake at the bottom. The inspector put his thumbs under his waistcoat. Escalators is for the benefit and convenience of passengers, he said sternly, not for the likes of young bears to play on, especially in the rush hour. Yes, sir, said Paddington, raising his hat, but we don't have Lators, said the inspector helpfully. Lators, said Paddington, in darkest Peru. I've never been on one before, so it's rather difficult. Darkest Peru, said the inspector, looking most impressed. Oh, well, in that case... He lifted up the chain which divided the up and the down escalators. You better get back down. But don't let me catch you up to any tricks again. Thank you very much, said Paddington gratefully as he ducked under the chain. It's very kind of you, I'm sure. He turned to wave goodbye. But before he could raise his hat, he found himself being whisked into the depths of the underground again. Halfway down, he was gazing with interest at the brightly coloured posters on the wall, when the man standing behind poked him with his umbrella. There's someone calling you, he said. Paddington looked round and was just in time to see Mrs. Brown and Judy pass by on their way up. They waved frantically at him, and Mrs. Brown called out, "Stop," several times. Paddington turned and tried to run up the escalator, but it's going very fast. And with his short legs, it was as much as he could do, even to stand still. He had his head down. He didn't notice a fat man with a briefcase who was running in the opposite direction until it was too late. There was a roar of rage from the fat man, and he toppled over and grabbed at several other people. Paddington felt himself falling. He went bump, 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 all the way down before he shot off the end and finally skidded to a stop by the wall. When he looked round, everything seemed very confused. A number of people were gathered round the fat man, who was sitting on the floor rubbing his head. Away in the distance, he could see Mrs. Brown and Judy trying to push their way down the up escalator. It was while he was watching their efforts that he saw another notice. It was in a brass case at the bottom of the escalator, and it said, in big red letters, "To stop the escalator in cases of emergency, push the button." It also said, in much smaller letters, "Penalty for improper use, £5. But in his hurry, Paddington didn't notice this. In any case, it seemed to him very much of an emergency. He swung his suitcase through the air and hit the button as hard as he could. If there had been confusion while the escalator was moving, there was even more when it stopped. Paddington watched with surprise as everyone started running about in different directions, shouting at each other. One man even began calling out "Fire!" and somewhere in the distance a bell began to ring. He was just thinking what a lot of excitement pressing one small button could cause, when a heavy hand descended on his shoulder. "That's him," someone shouted, pointing an accusing finger. "Saw him do it with my own eyes, as large as life." "Hit it with his suitcase," shouted another voice. "Ought not to be allowed." While from the back of the crowd, someone else suggested sending for the police. Paddington began to feel frightened. He turned and looked up at the owner of the hand. "Ho," said a stern voice, "it's you again. I might have known." The inspector took out a notebook. "Name, please." Paddington," said Paddington. "I said, what's your name, not where you want to go," repeated the inspector. "That's right," said Paddington. "That is my name." "Paddington," said the inspector unbelievingly. "It can't be. That's the name of a station. I've never heard of a bear called Paddington before." It's very unusual, said Paddington, but it's Paddington Brown, and I live at number 32 Windsor Gardens, and I've lost Mrs. Brown and Judy. Oh, the inspector wrote something in his book. Can I see your ticket? I had it, said Paddington, but I don't seem to anymore. The inspector began writing again. Playing on the escalator, travelling without a ticket, stopping the escalator, all serious offences they are. He looked up. What have you got to say to that, young fellow, my lad? Well, Paddington shifted uneasily and looked down at his paws. You try looking inside your hat, asked the inspector, not unkindly. People often put their tickets in there. Paddington jumped with relief. I knew I had it somewhere, he said thankfully as he handed it to the inspector. The inspector handed it back again quickly. The inside of Paddington's hat was rather sticky. I've never known anyone take so long not to get anywhere, he said, looking hard at Paddington. Do you often travel on the Underground? It's the first time, said Paddington. And the last, if I have anything to do with it, said Mrs. Brown as she pushed away through the crowd. Is this your bear, madam? Asked the inspector. Because if it is, I have to inform you that he's in serious trouble. He began to read from his notebook. As far as I can see, he's broken 2 important regulations, probably more. I shall have to give him into custody. Oh dear, Mrs. Brown clutched at Judy for support. Do you have to? He's only small and it's his first time out in London. I'm sure he won't do it again. Ignorance of the law is no excuse, said the inspector ominously. Persons are expected to abide by the regulations. Judy took hold of Paddington's paw and squeezed it reassuringly. Did you say persons are expected to abide by the regulations, she asked. That's right, began the inspector, and I have my duty to do, the same as everyone else. It doesn't say anything about bears, asked Judy innocently. Well, the inspector scratched his head. Not in so many words. He looked down at Judy and then at Paddington, and then all around. The escalator had started up again, and the crowd of sightseers had disappeared. It's all highly irregular, he said, but... Oh, thank you, said Judy. I think you're the kindest man I've ever met. Don't you think so, Paddington? Paddington nodded his head vigorously, and the inspector blushed. I shall always travel on this Underground in future, said Paddington politely. I'm sure it's the nicest in all London. The inspector opened his mouth and seemed about to say something, but he closed it again. Come along, children, said Mrs. Brown hastily. If we don't hurry up, we shall never get our shopping done. From somewhere up above came the sound of some dogs barking. The inspector sighed. I can't understand it, he said. This used to be such a well-run, respectable station. Now look at it. He stared after the retreating figures of Mrs. Brown and Judy, with Paddington bringing up the rear, and then rubbed his eyes. That's funny, he said, more to himself. I must be seeing things. I could have sworn that bear had some bacon sticking out of his case. He shrugged his shoulders. There were more important things to worry about. Judging by the noise coming from the top of the escalator, there was some sort of dog fight going on. It needed investigating. The man in the gentleman's outfitting department at Barkridge's held Paddington's hat at arm's length between thumb and forefinger. He looked at it distastefully. I take it the young, gentleman will not be requiring this any more, madam, he said. Oh, yes, I shall, said Paddington firmly. I've always had that hat, ever since I was small. But wouldn't you like a nice new one, Paddington, said Mrs. Brown, hastily. For best. Paddington thought for a moment. I'll have one for worst, if you like, he said. That's my best one. The salesman shuddered slightly, and averting his gaze, placed the offending article on the far end of the counter. Albert, he beckoned to a youth who was hovering in the background. See what we have in 4 7/8. Albert began to rummage under the counter. And now, while we're about it, said Mrs. Brown, we'd like a nice warm coat for the winter. Something like a duffel coat with toggles, so that he can do it up easily, I thought. And we'd also like a plastic raincoat for the summer. The salesman looked at her haughtily. He wasn't very fond of bears, and this one especially had been giving him some queer looks ever since he'd mentioned his wretched hat. Has Madam tried the bargain basement, he began. Something in government surplus. No, I haven't, said Mrs. Brown hotly. Government surplus, indeed. I never heard of such a thing. Have you, Paddington?" "No," said Paddington, who had no idea of what government surplus was. "Never." He stared at the man, who looked away uneasily. Paddington had a very persistent stare when he cared to use it. It was a very powerful stare, one which his Aunt Lucy had taught him and which he kept for special occasions. Mrs. Brown pointed to a smart blue duffel coat with a red lining. "That looks the very thing," she said. The assistant gulped. "Yes, madam, certainly, madam." He beckoned to Paddington. "Come this way, sir." Paddington allowed the assistant to help him on with the coat, and then stood admiring himself in the mirror. It was the first coat he'd ever possessed. In Peru it had been very hot, and though his Aunt Lucy made him wear a hat to prevent sunstroke, it had always been much too warm for a coat of any sort. He looked at himself in the mirror and was surprised to see not one, but a long line of bears stretching away as far as the eye could see. In fact, everywhere he looked there were bears, and they were all looking extremely smart. "Isn't the hood a trifle large?" asked Mrs. Brown anxiously. "Hoods are being worn large this year, madam," said the assistant. "It's the latest fashion." He was about to add that Paddington seemed to have rather a large head anyway, but he changed his mind. Bears were rather unpredictable. You never quite knew what they were thinking, and this one in particular seemed to have a mind of his own. "Do you like it, Paddington?" asked Mrs. Brown. Paddington gave up counting bears in the mirror and turned round to look at the back view. "I think it's the nicest coat I've ever seen," he said after a moment's thought. Mrs. Brown and the assistant heaved a sigh of relief. "Good," said Mrs. Brown. "That's settled then. Now there's just a question of a hat and a plastic mackintosh." She walked over to the hat counter where Albert, who could still hardly take his admiring eyes off Paddington, had arranged a huge pile of hats. There were bowler hats, sun hats, trilby hats, berries, and even a very small top hat. Mrs. Brown eyed them doubtfully. "It's difficult," she said, looking at Paddington. "It's largely a question of his ears. They stick out rather." "You could cut some holes for them," said Albert. The assistant froze him with a glance. "Cut a hole in a Barkridge's hat!" he exclaimed. "I've never heard of such a thing." Paddington turned and stared at him. The assistant's voice trailed off. I'll go and fetch my scissors," he said in a queer voice. "I don't think that would be necessary at all," said Mrs. Brown hurriedly. "It's not as if he has to go to work in a city, so he doesn't want anything too smart. I think this woolen berry is very nice, the one with a pom-pom on top. The green will go well with his new coat, and it'll stretch so that he can pull it down over his ears when it gets cold." After shaking hands with Albert, Paddington gave the assistant one more long, hard stare, and the unfortunate man collapsed into a chair and began mopping his brow as Mrs. Brown led the way out through the door. Barkridge's was a large shop. It even had its own escalator as well as several lifts. Mrs. Brown hesitated at the door, and then took Paddington's paw firmly in her hand and led him towards the lift. She'd had enough of escalators for one day. But to Paddington everything was new, or almost everything. He liked trying strange things. After a few seconds he decided quite definitely that he preferred riding on an escalator. They were nice and smooth, but lifts... To start with, it was full of people carrying parcels, and all so busy they hadn't time to notice a small bear. One woman even rested her shopping bag on his head and seemed quite surprised when Paddington pushed it off. And suddenly, half of him seemed to fall away while the other half stayed where it was. Just as he got used to that feeling, the second half of him caught up again, and even overtook the first half before the doors opened. It did that 4 times on the way down, and Paddington was glad when the man in charge said it was the ground floor, and Mrs. Brown let him out. She looked at him closely. "Oh dear, Paddington, you look quite pale," she said. Are you all right?" "I feel sick," said Paddington. "I don't like lifts, and I wish I hadn't had such a big breakfast." "Oh dear," Mrs. Brown looked around. Judy, who had gone off to do some shopping on her own, was nowhere to be seen. "Will you be right sitting here for a few minutes while I go off to find Judy?" she asked. Paddington sank down onto his case, looking very mournful. Even the pom-pom in his hat seemed limp. "I don't know whether I should be all right," he said, "but I'll do my best." "I'll be as quick as I can," said Mrs. Brown. "Then we can take a taxi home for lunch." Paddington groaned. "Poor Paddington," said Mrs. Brown. "You must be feeling bad if you don't want any lunch." At the word lunch again, Paddington closed his eyes and gave an even louder groan. Mrs. Brown tiptoed away. Paddington kept his eyes closed for several minutes, and then, as he began to feel better, he gradually became aware that every now and then a nice, cool draught of air blew over his face. He opened one eye carefully to see where it was coming from, and noticed for the first time that he was sitting near the main entrance to the shop. He opened his other eye and decided to investigate. If he stayed just outside the glass door, he could still see Mrs. Brown and Judy when they came. And then, as he bent down to pick up his suitcase, everything suddenly went black. Oh dear, thought Paddington, now all the lights have gone out. He began groping his way with outstretched paws towards the door. He gave a push where he thought it ought to be, but nothing happened. He tried moving along the wall a little and gave another push. This time it did move. The door seemed to have a strong spring on it, and he had to push hard to make it open, but eventually there was a gap big enough for him to squeeze through. It clanged shut behind him, and Paddington was disappointed to find it was just as dark outside as it had been in the shop. He began to wish he'd stayed where he was. He turned round and tried to find the door, but it seemed to have disappeared. He decided it might be easier if he got down on his paws and crawled. He went a little way like this, and his head came up against something hard. He tried to push it to one side with his paw, and it moved slightly, so he pushed again. Suddenly, there was a noise like thunder. Before he knew where he was, a whole mountain of things began to fall on him. He felt as if the whole sky had fallen on him. Everything went quiet. He lay where he was for a few minutes with his eyes tightly shut, hardly daring to breathe. From a long way away he could hear voices, and once or twice it sounded as if someone was banging on a window. He opened one eye carefully and was surprised to find the light had come on again. At least, sheepishly he pushed the hood of his duffel coat up over his head. They hadn't gone out at all. His hood must have fallen over his head when he bent down inside the shop to pick up his case. Paddington sat up and looked around to see where he was. He felt much better now. Somewhat to his astonishment, he found he was sitting in a small room, in the middle of which was a great pile of tins and basins and bowls. He rubbed his eyes and stared round-eyed at the sight. Behind him there was a wall with a door in it, and in front of him there was a large window. On the other side of the window there was a crowd of people pushing one another and pointing in his direction. Paddington decided with pleasure that they must be pointing at him. He stood up with difficulty, because it was hard standing up straight on top of a lot of tins, and pulled a pom-pom in his hat as high as it would go. A cheer went up from the crowd. Paddington gave a bow, waved several times, and then started to examine the damage all around him. For a moment he wasn't quite sure where he was, and then it came to him. Instead of going into the street, he must have opened a door leading to one of the shop windows. He looked round thoughtfully. "Oh dear," he said to the world in general, "I'm in trouble again." It was getting warm inside the window, so he took off his duffel coat and hung it carefully on a nail. Then he picked up a glass shelf and tried balancing it on top of some tins. It seemed to work, so he put some more tins and a washing bowl on top of that. It was rather wobbly, but he stood back and examined it. Yes, it looked quite nice. There was an encouraging round of applause from outside. Paddington waved a paw at the crowd and picked up another shelf. Inside the shop, Mrs. Brown was having an earnest conversation with the store detective. "You say you left him here, madam," the detective was saying. "That's right," said Mrs. Brown. "He's feeling ill, and I told him not to go away. His name's Paddington." Paddington. The detective wrote it carefully in his notebook. "What sort of bear is he?" "Oh, he's sort of golden," said Mrs. Brown. "He's wearing a blue duffel coat and carrying a suitcase. And he has black ears," said Judy. "You can't mistake him." "Black ears," the detective repeated, licking his pencil. "Don't expect that'll help much," said Mrs. Brown. "He's wearing his berry." The detective cupped his hand over his ear. "His what?" he shouted. There really was a terrible noise coming from somewhere. It seemed to be getting worse every minute. Every now and then there was a round of applause, and several times he distinctly heard the sound of people cheering. "His berry!" shouted Mrs. Brown in return. "A green woolen one that came down over his ears with a pom-pom." The detective shut his notebook with a snap. The noise outside was definitely getting worse. "Pardon me," he said sternly. "There's something queer going on that needs investigating." Mrs. Brown and Judy exchanged glances. The same thought was running through both their minds. They rushed after the detective. Mrs. Brown clung to the detective's coat, and Judy clung to Mrs. Brown's as they forced their way through the crowd on the pavement. Just as they reached the window, a tremendous cheer went up. "I might have known," said Mrs. Brown. "Paddington!" exclaimed Judy. Paddington had just reached the top of his pyramid. At least, it had started off to be a pyramid, but it wasn't really. It wasn't any particular shape at all, and it was very rickety. Having placed the last tin on the top, Paddington was in trouble. He wanted to get down, but he couldn't. He reached out a paw, and the mountain began to wobble. Paddington clung helplessly to the tins, swaying to and fro, watched by a fascinated audience. And then, without any warning, the whole lot collapsed again. Only this time, Paddington was on top and not underneath. A groan of disappointment went up from the crowd. "Best thing I've seen in years," said the man in the crowd to Mrs. Brown. "Blessed if I know how they think these things up." "Will he do it again, Mummy?" asked the small boy. "Don't think so, dear," said his mother. "I think he's finished for the day." She pointed to the window where the detective was removing a very sorry-looking Paddington. Mrs. Brown hurried back to the entrance, followed by Judy. Inside the shop, the detective looked at Paddington and then at his notebook. "Blue duffel coat," he said. "Green woolen berry." He pulled the berry off. "Black ears. I know who you are," he said grimly. "You're Paddington." Paddington nearly fell backwards with astonishment. "How ever did you know that?" he said. "I'm a detective," said the man. "It's my job to know these things. We're always on the lookout for criminals." "But I'm not a criminal," said Paddington hotly. "I'm a bear. Besides, I was only tidying up the window." "Tidying up the window?" the detective spluttered. "I don't know what Mr. Perkins will have to say. He only dressed it this morning." Paddington looked round uneasily. He could see Mrs. Brown and Judy hurrying towards him. In fact, there were several people coming his way, including an important-looking man in a black coat and striped trousers. They all reached him at the same time, and all began talking together. Paddington sat down on his case and watched them. There were times when it was much better to keep quiet, and this was one of them. In the end, it was the important-looking man who won, because he had the loudest voice and kept on talking when everyone else had finished. To Paddington's surprise, he reached down, took hold of his paw, and started to shake it so hard he thought it was going to drop off. "Delighted to know you, Bear," he boomed. "Delighted to know you, and congratulations." "That's all right," said Paddington doubtfully. He didn't know why, but the man seemed very pleased. The man turned to Mrs. Brown. "You say his name's Paddington?" "That's right," said Mrs. Brown. "I'm sure he didn't mean any harm." "Harm?" The man looked at Mrs. Brown in amazement. "Did you say harm? My dear lady, through the action of this bear, we've had the biggest crowd in years. Our telephone hasn't stopped ringing." He waved towards the entrance to the store. "And still they come." He placed his hand on Paddington's head. "Barkridge's," he said. "Barkridge's is grateful." He waved his other hand for silence. "We would like to show our gratitude. If there is anything in the store you would like." Paddington's eyes gleamed. He knew just what he wanted. He'd seen it on their way up to the outfitting department. It had been standing all by itself on a counter in the food store. The biggest one he'd ever seen. Almost as big as himself. "Please," he said, "I'd like one of those jars of marmalade. One of the big ones." If the manager of Barkridge's felt surprise, he didn't show it. He stood respectfully to one side by the entrance to the lift. "Marmalade it shall be," he said, pressing the button. "I think," said Paddington, "if you don't mind, I'd rather use the stairs."